The dust devils danced across the scorched earth of Bitter Creek Trading Post like restless spirits, swirling red dirt into the blazing Tennessee sun. The year was 1847, and this godforsaken outpost sat like a festering wound on the edge of Cherokee territory, where desperate men came to trade in things that shouldn't be traded and make deals that shouldn't be made. Cale Nighthawk crouched in the shadow of a massive oak tree, his dark eyes fixed on the weathered wooden buildings below. The Cherokee warrior's bronze skin glistened with sweat beneath the merciless sun, his long black hair bound with leather strips and hawk feathers that marked his status as a war chief of the Eastern Cherokee Band.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the cavalry saber that had nearly killed him at Canyon de los Muertos 3 winters ago today. Cale had come to this place of shame with a purpose that burned in his chest like swallowed fire. The white soldiers had taken his younger brother Ian during a dawn raid on their village, dragging the boy away in chains along with 12 other Apache children. The army called it relocation for education, but Cale knew the truth. They were stealing Apache souls, trying to kill the warrior spirit in his people, one child at a time. Word had reached him through the network of traders and half-breeds who moved between the two worlds that Ian was being held at Fort Campbell, scheduled for transport to one of the government schools back east where they cut Indian hair, forbade native languages, and beat the heritage out of children until nothing remained but hollow-eyed ghosts. Cale had tried the direct approach first. He'd ridden to Fort Campbell under a flag of truce, offering to trade 20 of his finest horses for his brother's freedom. Colonel Harrison had laughed in his face, told him that savage children belonged in civilization, not running wild with heathen tribes. The meeting had ended with Cale's hand on his tomahawk and 6 rifle barrels pointed at his chest, but there were other ways to reach a fort full of soldiers, ways that required skills the Apache didn't possess. Skills that only one type of person could provide, someone who moved like smoke through enemy territory, someone who could slip past sentries and unlock doors that were meant to stay locked forever. That's what had brought him to Bitter Creek, to this den of outlaws and outcasts where human flesh was bought and sold like cattle. The trading post served men who lived outside the law, rustlers, deserters, Cherokee renegades, and worse. Its owner, a bloated pig of a man named Silas Murdoch, dealt in stolen goods, illegal whiskey, and anything else that turned a profit, including people. Cale rose from his hiding spot and walked toward the trading post with the measured stride of a predator approaching prey. His moccasins made no sound on the hard-packed earth, and his buckskin leggings and war shirt were earth-colored, designed to blend with the forest landscape. A bone-handled knife hung at his side, along with a tomahawk that had tasted the blood of 17 enemies. Across his back, a bow made from mountain sheep horn and sinew waited beside a quiver of iron-tipped arrows. The trading post's main building squatted like a toad in the desert heat, its adobe walls sweating moisture that evaporated before it could provide relief. A ramshackle porch ran along the front, shaded by a roof that looked ready to collapse at the first strong wind. Rough men lounged in whatever shade they could find, nursing bottles of rot-gut whiskey and eyeing each other with the suspicion of wolves circling a kill. Cale pushed through the batwing doors into the dim interior, where the stench of unwashed bodies, stale alcohol, and something else, something rotten and desperate, hung in the air like a curse. The main room was crowded with the kind of men who preyed on weakness, their faces scarred by violence and their eyes empty of mercy. At the far end of the room, Silas Murdoch held court from behind a massive oak bar scarred with knife marks and burn stains. He was a mountain of flesh stuffed into clothes that had once been fine, but now bore the stains of 1,000 crook deals. His small eyes, nearly lost in the folds of his face, glittered with the greed of a man who would sell his Own mother for the right price. Well, well, Murdoch wheezed as Cale approached, his voice like sand grinding against stone. Look what the desert wind blew in. Cale Nighthawk himself, terror of the territory, come calling at my humble establishment. The room fell silent, except for the buzz of flies and the tick of a clock that had stopped working years ago. Every eye turned toward the Cherokee warrior, hands drifting toward weapons with the unconscious movement of men who lived by violence. Cale stopped 3 paces from the bar, close enough to strike but far enough to dodge. I came to trade, Murdoch. Not to spill blood on your floor. Trade, is it? Murdoch's laugh was like the sound of a shovel digging a grave. And what might the mighty war chief have that old Silas would want? From beneath his war shirt, Cale produced a leather pouch that jingled with the weight of silver coins, Mexican pesos, American eagles, and Spanish reales acquired through raids on wagon trains and trading expeditions. He set it on the bar with a solid thunk that made several men lean forward. I need someone who can move unseen, Cale said quietly. Someone who knows the ways of locks and walls, who can slip past guards like morning mist. Murdoch's eyes fixed on the pouch like a snake watching a mouse. Ah, you need a sneak thief. A shadow dancer. Someone to liberate something that don't belong to you, I'd wager. Do you have such a person or not? Might be I do, might be I don't. Depends on what you're offering and what you need done. Cale's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. Fort Campbell. I need someone inside who can open doors and move without being seen. The room erupted in knowing laughter. A grizzled prospector missing most of his teeth cackled loud enough to rattle the windows. Fort Campbell? Hell, Injun, you might as well ask him to steal the moon. That's a tall order, even for me, Murdoch said, though his eyes never left. The money pouch. Fort Campbell's tighter than a virgin's corset. You'd need someone special for a job like that. Someone with particular ... talents. Name your price. Murdoch was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the scarred wood of the bar. When he spoke, his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who held all the cards. Well, now, it just so happens I acquired something recently that might suit your needs. But she ain't for sale, she's for trade only. She? Oh yes, definitely a she. And what a she is. Murdoch's grin revealed teeth like yellow tombstones. Meanest little hellcat I ever did see. Been through 3 owners in 2 months, and each one begged me to take her back. Says she's too savage to tame, too wild to train. A chill ran down Cale's spine that had nothing to do with the desert wind. What are you suggesting? Straight trade, warrior to businessman. You're silver for my little wildcat. But I warn you, she's got teeth, and she ain't afraid to use them. Before Cale could respond, a commotion erupted from the back room. The sound of splintering wood was followed by a man's yelp of pain and a string of curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. Speak of the devil, Murdoch chuckled. Sounds like she's entertaining our guests again. The back room door burst open, and 3 men stumbled out in various states of distress. The first clutched a bleeding nose, the second nursed scratched cheeks, and the third limped badly while holding his groin. She bit me, the first man wailed. The crazy squaw damn near took my finger off. I told you boys not to get too familiar, Murdoch said with mock sympathy. But did you listen? Course not. Behind the 3 wounded men, a 4th figure emerged from the shadows of the back room. She moved with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders like a waterfall of midnight. Her buckskin dress, though worn and stained, couldn't hide the proud set of her shoulders or the defiant lift of her chin. But it was her eyes that struck Cale like a physical blow, dark as storm clouds, and just as dangerous. They swept the room with the fearless gaze of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. This was no broken captive or cowering victim. This was a warrior,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Gentlemen, Murdoch announced with theatrical flourish, meet Ayanna Stormcrow. Cherokee by birth, wildcat by nature, and the finest sneak thief this side of the Mississippi. Ayanna. The name hit Cale like a war club to the chest. In Cherokee, it meant eternal blossom, a name given to daughters born under the full moon, daughters destined for greatness. But more than the name, it was her bearing that stopped his breath. She moved like she owned the earth beneath her feet, her spine straight as a pine tree, her dark eyes holding secrets that could burn down the world. She was beautiful in the way storms were beautiful, dangerous, and wild, and completely untamable. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, marked here and there with small scars that spoke of violence survived rather than inflicted. High cheekbones and a strong jaw gave her face the kind of strength that weak men called masculine and wise men called magnificent. But it was the intelligence in her eyes that made Cale's chest tighten with something he couldn't name. This wasn't some broken captive or desperate criminal. This was someone who had chosen her path, who wore her wildness like armor and her savagery like a crown. She's been through 3 owners, Murdoch continued, clearly enjoying the attention. First was a cavalry colonel who thought he could break her like a Mustang. She picked the lock on his quarters, stole his dress uniform, and sold it to a whorehouse. In El Paso, made the man look like a fool in front of his superiors. A few of the men chuckled, but Cale noticed how their eyes never left Ayanna, how they watched her like she was a coiled rattlesnake that might strike at any moment. Second owner was a cattle baron up north. Rich man, thought money could buy him anything. She lasted 2 weeks before she cleaned out his safe and disappeared with his prize stallion. Found her 3 days later at a Cherokee settlement, said she was returning stolen property to its rightful owners. And the third? Cale asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Murdoch's grin widened. Third was a bounty hunter named Black Pete Morrison. Mean son of a bitch who specialized in tracking runaway slaves and Indians. She waited until he was drunk, tied him naked to a cactus, and left him for the buzzards. Pete lived, but he ain't the same man he was. Despite himself, Cale felt a flicker of admiration. Any woman who could outsmart 3 different captors and survive to tell about it was either incredibly lucky or incredibly dangerous. Probably both. What makes you think she won't do the same to me? He asked. Maybe she will, Murdoch shrugged. But you ain't looking to own her, are you, warrior? You just need her skills for one job. And from what I hear, she's got reason to hate the army as much as you do. Cale's eyes snapped to Ayanna, searching her face for confirmation. For just a moment, her mask of defiance slipped, and he saw something raw and painful flicker across her features. Loss, rage, the kind of wounds that never fully healed. My family was killed in the Georgia removal, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of old grief. Soldiers came to our village with promises of safe passage west. Instead, they herded us like cattle into camps where children starved and elders froze to death. I watched my parents die of fever in one of those camps, watched my little brother waste away to nothing. The room fell silent. Even these hardened criminals seemed sobered by the simple brutality of her words. I escaped during a river crossing. Ayanna continued. Been running ever since, taking whatever I could from the men who took everything from me. If you're planning to hit Fort Campbell, then we want the same thing to make the army pay. Cale studied her face, reading the truth in her eyes. The Cherokee removal had been a wound that still bled in his people's collective memory. Thousands, driven from their ancestral lands, forced to walk the trail of tears through winter cold and summer heat. Those who survived arrived in Indian territory broken in body and spirit, their culture scattered like leaves in a hurricane. But Ayanna hadn't broken. She'd turned her pain into purpose, her loss into weapons. She was exactly what he needed, someone who could move like smoke through enemy territory. Someone who understood that sometimes survival required savagery. The job is simple, Cale said, making his decision. Get into Fort Campbell, locate my brother, and help him escape. No killing unless absolutely necessary, no unnecessary risks. In and out clean. Your brother? Ayana's eyes sharpened with interest. Ayan Nighthawk. 12 years old, taken in a raid on our village 3 months ago. They're planning to ship him east to one of their schools. Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a softening that made her look younger and more vulnerable. I had a brother too, she said quietly. What's he look like? Small for his age, but strong. Black hair with a white streak above his left ear birthmark, our grandmother said meant he was blessed by the spirits. Scar on his chin from falling out of a tree last summer, Ayana nodded. I'll find him. The trade stands? Murdoch interrupted. Clearly eager to close the deal, Cale looked at the silver in his pouch, then at Ayana. Every instinct told him he was about to make either the best decision of his life or the last one. But his brother was worth any risk, and something about this fierce woman made him believe she might be worth it too. The trade stands, he said, pushing the pouch across the bar. Murdoch's fat fingers closed around the silver like a spider capturing a fly. Pleasure doing business, Chief. She's all yours now. I don't belong to anyone, Ayana said sharply, her eyes flashing with dangerous fire. Course not, Murdoch backpedaled quickly. Figure of speech, darling. You're partnered up now. Free as birds. Cale stepped toward Ayana, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I'm not buying you, he said quietly. I'm hiring you. When the job's done, you go where you want. She searched his face for lies, for the kind of traps men like Murdoch specialized in setting. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she gave a sharp nod. When do we leave? Tonight. Fort Campbell is 3 days hard ride north, and my brother's transport leaves at the end of the week. I'll need supplies. Rope, lockpicks, a good knife. Already arranged, Cale said. My horse is hidden in the canyon behind the ridge. We can be 20 miles away before anyone notices we're gone. Ayana moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at the room full of outlaws and degenerates. Anyone follows us, anyone tries to collect bounty on either of us. I'll show you what too savage really means. Her words carried the promise of violence delivered with surgical precision, and several men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even in this room full of killers and thieves, Ayana Stormcrow commanded respect through sheer force of will. As they stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun, Cale felt the weight of what he'd just done settle on his shoulders like a mantle. He'd allied himself with a woman who was either going to save his brother or get them both killed. Possibly both. But as he watched Ayana stride across the dusty ground with the confidence of a queen surveying her domain, he realized he was looking forward to finding out which it would be. For the first time in months, he felt something other than desperation driving him forward. He felt hope. And hope, Cale had learned, was the most dangerous emotion of all. The Cherokee stallion's hooves struck sparks against the Rocky Mountain trail as Cale guided them deeper into the Tennessee wilderness. Behind him, Ayana rode with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle, her dark hair streaming like a war banner in the wind. They had been climbing for 6 hours since leaving Bitter Creek, following ancient hunting paths that threaded between towering pines and limestone cliffs. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two predators who understood that unnecessary words could mean the difference between life and death. But as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Cale found himself stealing glances at his unlikely companion, trying to read the story written in her scars and the set of her shoulders. Ayana Stormcrow was unlike any woman he had ever encountered. Most Cherokee women, even the fiercest warriors among them, carried themselves with a certain measured dignity that spoke of careful training in the old ways. Ayanna moved like she had been raised by wolves, all controlled violence and barely contained wildness. Every gesture was calculated for maximum efficiency. Every glance cataloged potential threats and escape routes. When they finally stopped to rest the horses, beside a crystal-clear mountain stream, the sun was hanging low above the western peaks like a copper shield. Cale dismounted and began checking his stallion's hooves, while Ayanna scouted their immediate surroundings with the thoroughness of someone who had learned never to trust appearances. "The horses can't maintain this pace," she said, returning from her reconnaissance. "Your stallion's favoring his left front hoof, and the mare's breathing too hard for the elevation." Cale looked up in surprise. He'd been so focused on putting distance between them and potential pursuit that he'd missed the signs. She'd spotted immediately. "How far behind do you think they are?" "Who? Murdoch's men?" Ayanna knelt beside the stream and cupped water in, her hands drinking deeply before splashing her face. "They're not following us." "How can you be certain?" She gave him a look that managed to be both amused and slightly pitying. "Because Silas Murdoch is a businessman, not a warrior. He got his silver, and now we're someone else's problem. Besides," she added with a predatory smile, "I left him a little reminder of why crossing me is a bad idea." Cale's eyes narrowed. "What kind of reminder?" Instead of answering directly, Ayanna reached into her buckskin pouch and withdrew a familiar object, Murdoch's gold pocket watch, the one he'd been consulting during their negotiations. The chain was broken, as if it had been yanked forcefully from his vest. "When did you?" Cale began, then stopped. He'd been watching her the entire time at the trading post, and he'd never seen her move within reach of Murdoch. "Professional." "Secret," Ayanna said, tucking the watch away. "Let's just say fat men who underestimate Cherokee women tend to learn expensive lessons." For the first time since their partnership began, Cale found himself genuinely impressed. Pickpocketing Murdoch under the noses of a room full of armed criminals required skills that went beyond simple thievery. It required the kind of supernatural awareness that Cherokee elders called ghost walking. "Your grandmother taught you." "The old ways," he said. It wasn't a question. Ayanna's expression flickered, just for a moment, and he saw something vulnerable beneath her armor of competence. "My grandmother taught me many things. Most of them involved staying alive when the world wants you dead." She stood abruptly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "We should make camp. There's a cave system about half a mile up the ridge, defensible position, fresh water, and concealed from the main trail." They led their horses up a narrow game trail that switched back through dense stands of mountain laurel and wild rhododendron. The cave Ayanna had spotted turned out to be perfect for their needs, large enough for the horses, with a hidden entrance that could only be seen from one specific angle. As they settled in for the night, Cale found himself studying his companion with growing curiosity. She moved around their temporary camp with the efficiency of long practice, checking sight lines, identifying escape routes, and setting up early warning systems with pieces of string and small stones that would alert them to any approaching danger. "You've done this before," he observed. "More times than I care to count." Ayanna was building a small smokeless fire using techniques that would have impressed a Cherokee scout. 3 years of running from bounty hunters teaches you to think like prey. And once you understand how prey thinks, you can start thinking like a predator instead. Is that what you are? A predator? She looked up from the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "What do you think?" Cale considered the question seriously. In the trading post, he'd seen her face down a room full of dangerous men without flinching. On the trail, she demonstrated skills that went far beyond simple wilderness survival. And now, watching her prepare their camp with military precision, he was beginning to understand that Ayanna Stormcrow was something much more dangerous than a common thief. "I think," he said carefully, That you're someone who was trained for war but forced to use those skills for survival instead. Ayanna went very still. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the pines outside their cave. My father was a war chief, she said finally. Lakota Stormcrow, leader of the Overhill Cherokee in the years before the removal. He trained me the same way he trained my brothers to fight, to scout, to strike. Fast and disappear like morning mist. Your brothers? All dead. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Cale heard the pain beneath them. Killed defending our village when the soldiers came. My father died with a rifle in his hands and 3 bullets in his chest, still trying to buy time for the women and children to escape. Cale felt something cold settle in his stomach. You saw it happen. I was supposed to escape with the others, but I couldn't leave him. Ayanna's hands were steady as she fed twigs to the fire, but her voice carried the weight of old grief. I hid in the council house and watched my father make his last stand, watched him fall, watched the soldiers burn everything we'd ever built. How did you survive? My father's final order was to get the children to safety. So I gathered the survivors, mostly orphans by then, and led them into the mountains. We lived like wolves for 2 months, stealing what we needed, avoiding the army patrols, waiting for a chance to reach the Cherokee settlements in the west. But you never made it. Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh, we made it. All 17 children delivered safe to Chief John Ross's people in Indian Territory. But by then, I'd learned something important about myself, which was that I was very, very good at hurting the people who had hurt us. The confession hung between them like smoke. Cale found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about his companion. This wasn't just a skilled thief or even a desperate survivor. This was a Cherokee warrior who had been forged in the fires of genocide and tempered by 3 years of guerrilla warfare against impossible odds. The 3 owners Murdoch mentioned, he said slowly. They weren't random targets. The cavalry colonel was Lieutenant Marcus Bentley. He led the raid that killed my family. Ayanna's voice was conversational, but her eyes held the kind of cold fury that preceded executions. The cattle baron was William Morrison. He bought Cherokee land for pennies after the removal, built his fortune on our suffering. And Black Pete Morrison was his son, the bounty hunter who specialized in tracking escaped Cherokee children. You hunted them. I made them pay. She looked directly at him, and Cale saw no guilt in her expression, no regret. My grandmother always said that justice delayed is justice denied. I decided not to wait for the spirits to balance the scales. Cale was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what she'd revealed. He'd hired a thief to help him rescue his brother. Instead, he'd allied himself with something much more dangerous, a Cherokee assassin who had spent 3 years systematically hunting down the men responsible for her family's death. Are you afraid? She asked, apparently reading his thoughts. Should I be? That depends. Are you planning to betray me? Sell me to bounty hunters? Try to break me like some wild horse that needs taming? No. Then you have nothing to fear from me. She fed another branch to the fire, and the flames leaped higher. But the men holding your brother? They should probably start saying their prayers. Despite everything, the violence in her past, the casual way she discussed killing, the barely contained wildness that radiated from her like heat from a forged Cale, found himself oddly comforted by her words. He'd spent months planning his brother's rescue, knowing that he was probably walking into a death trap. Now for the first time, he was beginning to believe they might actually succeed. Tell me about Fort Campbell, Ayanna said, apparently deciding. They'd shared enough personal history for one evening. Layout, guard rotations, weak points. Cale pulled a piece of charcoal from the fire and began sketching on a flat stone. Built on a bluff overlooking the Cumberland River, main gate faces east, with guard towers at each corner. The prisoners are held in a stone blockhouse at the center of the compound. How many guards? 50 soldiers, give or take. Most of them are infantry farm boys from Ohio and Pennsylvania who've never fought anything more dangerous than drunk civilians. But not all of them. No, Colonel Harrison keeps a squad of cavalry scouts, hard men who know how to fight Indians. They're the real threat. Ayanna studied his rough map, her finger tracing potential approach routes. What about the river? Steep banks, fast current. Possible approach route, but we'd have to swim in full gear. I don't swim. Cale looked up in surprise. You don't swim? Never learned. Hard to practice when you're running for your life through desert country. She shrugged, apparently unconcerned by this limitation. We'll have to find another way in. The main gate is too heavily guarded, and the walls are 20 feet high with iron spikes along the top. Then we don't go over or through, Ayanna said thoughtfully. We go under. Under? She pointed to a section of his map. Every fort needs fresh water. Where do they get theirs? There's a spring about a quarter-mile upstream. They built an aqueduct to channel water into the compound. Stone or wood? Stone. Roman-style engineering. Colonel Harrison fancies himself a student of military history. Ayanna's eyes lit up with professional interest. Stone aqueducts need maintenance access. Service tunnels, inspection points, places where a small person could crawl through if they knew what they were doing. You think you can get inside that way? I think I can get us both inside that way. The question is what we do once we're there. Cale continued his sketch, adding details about the interior layout. The children are held in cells beneath the blockhouse. Heavy doors, iron locks, guards posted at the entrance. How many children? Last count was 23. Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, ranging in age from 8 to 15. We can't save them all. The words hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd already reached the same conclusion. I know, but maybe, no. Ayanna's voice was firm, but not unkind. I understand the impulse, believe me. But rescue missions succeed when they have clear, limited objectives. Try to save everyone, and you save no one. My brother, we'll find your brother. We'll get him out. But the others ... double quotes, she trailed off, her expression troubled. The best we can do for them is make sure they're captors. Pay for what they've done. You mean kill the guards? I mean make this fort too expensive to operate. Burn the supplies, destroy the records, create enough chaos that the army decides Indian children aren't worth the trouble. Cale studied her face in the firelight, seeing the warrior his father might have been proud to call daughter. You've thought about this before. I've thought about little else for 3 years. She stood and moved to the cave entrance, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Every night, I dream about those children on the Trail of Tears, the ones who died of cold and hunger and disease while soldiers watched and did nothing. I dream about my little brother, wasting away to nothing while his captors counted their government payments for relocating hostile Indians. Ayanna, I couldn't save him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I was his big sister, and I couldn't save him, but maybe I can save yours. Cale rose and joined her at the cave mouth. The Tennessee mountains stretched away in all directions, their peaks etched against the starlight like the backbone of some sleeping giant. Somewhere to the north, his brother was locked in a stone cell, probably terrified, definitely alone. Why? He asked quietly, why help me? You could disappear into these mountains and never be found. Start a new life somewhere else. Ayanna was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute truth. Because every Cherokee child they steal is my brother. Every family they destroy is my family. She turned to face him, and her eyes held the kind of determination that toppled empires. And because someone needs to teach them that we're not victims anymore, we're not running anymore. We're coming for them. The promise in her voice sent chills down Cale's spine. This wasn't just about rescuing his brother anymore. This was about striking back at an enemy that had taken everything from both of them. About proving that the Cherokee people were far from broken. As they settled down for the night, Cale found himself looking forward to reaching Fort Campbell with something approaching bloodthirsty anticipation. He'd thought he was partnering with a thief to stage a simple rescue mission. Instead, he'd allied himself with a Cherokee war goddess who was about to teach the United States Army why their grandfathers had learned to fear the sound of war cries echoing through these ancient mountains. Tomorrow, they would reach the fort. And then Colonel Harrison and his soldiers would discover what happened when they underestimated the fury of a people who had nothing left to lose. The stone aqueduct emerged from the mountainside like the backbone of some ancient creature, its Roman arches casting moonshadows across the forest floor. Cale and Ayanna lay flat against the mossy ground, studying the structure that would either deliver them into the heart of Fort Campbell or become their tomb. 3 days of scouting had revealed what Ayanna suspected: the aqueduct's maintenance. Tunnels were large enough for a person to crawl through, but barely. More importantly, they discovered that the fort's engineers had been careless. The main inspection shaft opened directly into the compound cistern room, which was connected to the prisoner block by a service corridor that guards rarely patrolled. "Remember," Ayanna whispered, her breath ghosting white in the cold mountain air, "we go in quiet, get your brother, and get out. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. And if we're discovered?" Her smile was sharp enough to cut moonbeams. "Then we remind them why their grandfathers were afraid of Cherokee war cries." The infiltration began at midnight. Ayanna led the way into the maintenance tunnel, moving through the narrow stone passage with the fluid grace of water finding its level. Behind her, Cale struggled to match her silent progress, his broader shoulders scraping against the ancient masonry as they crawled deeper into the aqueduct system. The tunnel was a nightmare of cramped spaces and pitch-black darkness, filled with the sound of rushing water and the skitter of rats disturbed from their nocturnal hunting. Every few feet, Ayanna would pause to listen, her senses stretched to their limits as she searched for any indication they'd been discovered. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached the cistern room. Ayanna pressed her ear against the stone grate that separated them from the fort's interior, listening for guards or other signs of activity. When she was satisfied they were alone, she produced a set of lockpicks that seemed to materialize from nowhere and went to work on the grate's simple mechanism. The lock surrendered to her expertise with barely a whisper of sound. Ayanna eased the grate open and slipped through like smoke, landing in a crouch with her knife already in her hand. Cale followed, his moccasins silent on the stone floor as he took in their surroundings. The cistern room was larger than expected, filled with the sound of water flowing through hidden channels. Moonlight streamed through high windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. More importantly, it was empty of guards, a stroke of luck that Ayanna's grandmother would have attributed to the spirits favoring their cause. "This way," Ayanna breathed, moving toward a heavy wooden door marked with military efficiency. She tested the handle and found it unlocked another small mercy in a mission that would need all the help it could get. The service corridor beyond was a study in military practicality, stone walls lined with pipes and conduits, lit by oil lamps placed at regular intervals. Their footsteps echoed softly as they made their way toward the prisoner block, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible alarm. They encountered their first guard at the junction leading to the main cell block. He was young, probably no older than 20, sitting on a wooden stool and fighting sleep with the determination of someone who knew the penalties for falling asleep on duty. Unfortunately for him, those penalties didn't include being silently strangled by a Cherokee assassin. Ayanna moved like death itself, flowing out of the shadows with her arms snaking around the guard's throat before he could draw breath to cry out. He struggled for perhaps 10 seconds before consciousness fled, leaving him slumped against the wall in what any casual observer would mistake for natural sleep. "He'll live," she whispered in response to Cale's questioning look. "But he'll wake up with a headache and no memory of the last few minutes." The cell block was a monument to American efficiency in the business of cultural destruction. 23 cells lined both sides of a central corridor, each containing a Cherokee, Creek, or Seminole child torn from their families and destined for the government schools that specialized in killing souls while leaving bodies intact. Cale moved down the corridor like a man walking through his own nightmares, peering into each cell in search of his brother. The children watched him with the wide, frightened eyes of prey animals, too traumatized to hope and too young to understand why the world had suddenly turned so cruel. He found Ian in the 7th cell on the left side, curled up in the corner on a pile of moldy straw that served as bedding. The boy looked smaller than Cale remembered, his face gaunt with poor food and the kind of despair that aged children before their time. But the white streak in his hair was unmistakable, and when he looked up at the sound of footsteps, Cale saw the same fierce intelligence that had always marked the Nighthawk bloodline. "Cale," the boy's voice was barely a whisper, as if he was afraid to believe what his eyes were telling him. "I'm here, brother," Cale replied, his own voice thick with emotion he couldn't suppress. "I've come to take you home." Ayanna had the cell lock picked in seconds, her tools working with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. The door swung open with a soft creak that sounded loud as thunder. In the oppressive silence of the cell block, Ian threw himself into his brother's arms with the desperate intensity of someone who had given up hope of ever seeing family again. Cale held him close, feeling how thin he'd become, how his small body trembled with malnutrition and fear. "The others," Ian whispered against his brother's chest. "We have to help the others." Cale's heart clenched, but Ayanna's words from their planning session echoed in his mind. "Try to save everyone, and you save no one. We can't, brother, not tonight. But they're just children. Which is why we're going to make sure this never happens again," Ayanna said firmly, appearing beside them like a shadow given substance. "Your brother's right. We can't save them all tonight. But we can make this fort so expensive to operate that the army thinks twice before stealing more children." As if summoned by her words, the sound of boots on stone echoed from the corridor beyond the cell block. Multiple sets, moving with the disciplined cadence of soldiers responding to an alarm. "Time to go," Ayanna said, her professional calm contrasting sharply with the sudden spike of danger in the air. But as they moved toward the service corridor, they discovered their escape route blocked by the very patrol they'd hoped to avoid. 6 soldiers in blue uniforms, led by a sergeant whose scarred face spoke of battles fought in places where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Well, the sergeant drawled, his rifle trained on Cale's chest. "Looks like we caught ourselves some redskin burglars. Colonel Harrison's gonna be mighty pleased." The corridor erupted into violence with the sudden brutality of a summer storm. Ayanna moved first, her knife flashing in the lamplight as she closed the distance to the nearest soldier within human speed. The man barely had time to register her presence before 6 inches of Cherokee steel found the gap between his ribs. Cale followed her lead, his tomahawk singing through the air to bury itself in the sergeant's shoulder with a wet thunk that sent the man spinning into the stone wall. Ian, despite his youth and weakened condition, grabbed a fallen rifle and used it to trip another soldier, sending him crashing into his comrades with bone-jarring force. The fight was brief but vicious, played out in the narrow confines of the corridor where superior numbers meant nothing and Cherokee training meant everything. When the last soldier fell unconscious to the stone floor, the silence that followed was broken only by their labored breathing and the distant sound of alarm bells beginning to ring throughout the fort. "They know we're here," Cale said unnecessarily. "Good," Ayanna replied, wiping her blade clean on a fallen soldier's uniform. I was getting tired of being subtle. She moved to the cell doors and began systematically destroying the locks with a heavy iron bar taken from one of the guards. "Can't free all the children tonight," she said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone settling old debts. "But I can make sure these cells never hold another Cherokee child." As the lock shattered under her assault, she called out to the imprisoned children in Cherokee Creek, and what little Seminole she knew. "When the soldiers come, tell them the Stormcrow sent a message. Tell them the Cherokee remember, and we're done running." The alarm bells were getting louder, joined now by the sound of shouting men and running feet. Somewhere in the fort, officers were organizing a search that would soon turn the entire compound into a trap with no way out. "The aqueduct?" Cale asked. "Compromised," Ayanna replied. "They'll figure out how we got in and block the tunnels." She shouldered her pack and checked her weapons with the calm efficiency of someone who had faced impossible odds before. "Time for Plan B. We don't have a Plan B." Her smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "We do now." Instead of retreating toward their entry point, Ayanna led them deeper into the fort, toward the sound of approaching soldiers and the growing chaos of an installation under attack. She moved with the confidence of someone who had studied the fort's layout until she could navigate it blindfolded, turning corners and climbing stairs with supernatural certainty. They emerged onto the fort's main parade ground just as the first organized search parties were forming up. The sight that greeted them was both terrifying and oddly beautiful. Dozens of soldiers with torches and rifles, officers shouting orders, and in the center of it all, Colonel Harrison himself, resplendent in his dress uniform despite the late hour. "There!" someone shouted, pointing at the three figures silhouetted against the torchlight. "The prisoners!" What followed was chaos on a scale that would be talked about in military circles for decades. Ayanna had spent 3 years studying American military tactics, learning their weaknesses and blind spots with the dedication of a scholar pursuing advanced degrees. Now she put that knowledge to devastating use. She didn't fight the soldiers. She turned them against each other. A thrown knife extinguished a torch here, a war cry from an unexpected direction there, and suddenly disciplined troops were firing at shadows and their own comrades. She moved through the confusion like a ghost, striking where they were weak and vanishing before they could respond. Meanwhile, Cale fought his way toward the fort's main gate with Ian clinging to his back, using his tomahawk and knife to clear a path through soldiers who had never faced an opponent trained in Cherokee warfare. His movements were economical, brutal, and absolutely effective, each strike calculated to disable rather than kill, each step taking them closer to freedom. The breakthrough came when Ayanna reached the fort's ammunition storage. The explosion that followed lit up the night sky like a second sun, sending debris raining down on the parade ground and turning organized pursuit into panicked evacuation efforts. In the confusion that followed, 3 figures slipped through the main gate and disappeared into the Tennessee wilderness like smoke on the wind. Behind them, Fort Campbell burned with fires that would take 3 days to fully extinguish, and 23 Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole children walked out through cell doors that would never lock again. By dawn, they were 10 miles away, hidden in a cave system that Ayanna had identified during their approach. Ian slept the deep sleep of someone who had been given back their life, while Cale and Ayanna took turns keeping watch and marveling at what they had accomplished. "The children," Cale said during his watch. "What will happen to them?" "Some will try to return to their families," Ayanna replied. "Others will disappear into the mountains and learn to live free. A few might even make it to the Cherokee settlements in the west," she shrugged. "Either way, they're not going to government schools designed to kill their spirits. And the fort will be rebuilt eventually. But every officer who was there last night will remember what happened when they tried to cage Cherokee children. Some lessons," she added with grim satisfaction, "are worth teaching in blood and fire." Cale looked at her in the growing light of dawn, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. This wasn't just a thief or even a warrior. This was something far more dangerous. This was a Cherokee woman who had turned her pain into purpose, her loss into a weapon that could strike at the heart of an empire. What happens now? He asked. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where their people had once lived in peace. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. Now we teach them that some things can't be taken. That some people won't be broken. That the Cherokee spirit burns brighter than all their schools and forts and civilizing missions combined. She turned to look at him, and in her dark eyes he saw the reflection of something that made his breath catch. Not love, not yet, but recognition, understanding, the beginning of something that could burn brighter than the fires they'd left behind. We make them remember, she said simply, why their grandfathers learned to fear the sound of war cries. In these mountains, the war drums had been silent in Cherokee territory for 15 years, but now they thundered across the Tennessee mountains like the heartbeat of an awakening giant. The news of Fort Campbell's destruction had spread through Indian country faster than wildfire, carried by runners who spoke in hushed, reverent tones of the Stormcrow's return and the warrior who stood beside her. Cale crouched at the edge of Crying Wolf Ridge, watching the valley below through a brass spyglass that had once belonged to a cavalry officer who no longer needed it. What he saw made his blood run cold. 300 soldiers, led by Colonel Harrison himself, moving through the forest with the methodical precision of men hunting something they intended to kill. They're not just looking for us, he said quietly to Ayanna, who lay beside him in the tall grass, her own field glasses trained on the approaching force. This is an army. Good, she replied, her voice carrying the deadly calm that had become her trademark. Let them come with all their men and horses and fancy uniforms. It just means more of them will learn what happens when you steal Cherokee children. Below them, Ayan sat with his back against an ancient oak, slowly recovering his strength with the help of traditional Cherokee medicines that Ayanna seemed to produce from thin air. The boy had grown quieter since their escape, his eyes holding shadows that spoke of things no 12-year-old should have witnessed. But beneath the trauma, Cale could see the same fierce spirit that had always burned in the Nighthawk bloodline, bruised, but unbroken, bent, but not shattered. The pursuit had been relentless. For 6 days, they'd stayed ahead of Harrison's forces through a combination of Cherokee, woodcraft, and Ayanna's supernatural ability to anticipate their enemies' movements. She read the land like other people read books, seeing stories in broken twigs and displaced stones that told her exactly where the soldiers were and where they were going. But even she couldn't run forever. The mountains that had once been Cherokee sanctuary were now crawling with blue-uniformed hunters who knew these valleys almost as well as the people they'd driven from them. Sooner or later, there would have to be a reckoning. They've split into 3 columns, Ayanna observed, her trained eye cataloging the enemy's disposition with military precision. Harrison's keeping the main force in the center while sending flanking elements up the east and west ridges. Classic pincer movement. He means to trap us in this valley. Can we break through? Not with Ayan slowing us down. The boy's brave, but he's still weak from months of captivity. She lowered her field glasses and turned to study Cale's face. There's another option, which is, we stop running and start fighting. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal. Fire. Cale had been dreading this moment since their escape from Fort Campbell, knowing it would inevitably come, but hoping against hope that they could somehow avoid it. 3 people against 300 soldiers wasn't a battle, it was a massacre, waiting to happen. You're talking about suicide, he said. I'm talking about making them pay such a price for this valley that they'll think twice before pursuing Cherokee families ever again. Ayanna's eyes held the kind of cold fire that had once made Cherokee war chiefs legends. Your brother didn't. Survive Fort Campbell just to die running through the woods. He deserves better than that. You both do. What did you have in mind? Instead of answering directly, Ayanna reached into her pack and withdrew a leather map case that Cale had never seen before. Inside were detailed topographical charts of the surrounding mountains, marked with Cherokee symbols that indicated everything from water sources to hidden caves to the locations of ancient burial grounds that white men feared to enter. My grandmother drew these maps, she said, spreading them on the ground between them. She was a war chief's daughter who married a war chief's son, and she knew every inch of these mountains. Before the removal, this valley was sacred ground, the place where our warriors came to speak with the spirits before battle. Cale studied the maps, his mind racing as he began to understand what she was suggesting. Thunder Falls. Thunder Falls, she confirmed. The narrow pass where our ancestors made their last stand against the Spanish conquistadors 2 centuries ago. 40 Cherokee warriors held that pass for 3 days against 1,000 Spanish soldiers. And they all died. But they died as Cherokee warriors, not as hunted animals. And they took so many enemies with them that the Spanish abandoned their expedition and never returned. Ayanna's finger traced the winding path that led to the legendary battle site. The terrain hasn't changed, Cale. Neither have the advantages. It offers to defenders who know how to use them. You want to make our stand there. I want to remind the United States Army why their maps still mark certain places as Cherokee territory. Enter at your own risk. The plan was audacious too. The point of madness, requiring them to reach Thunder Falls before Harrison's forces could complete their encirclement. But as Cale studied the terrain and began to understand the tactical advantages Ayanna had identified, he realized it might actually work. The pass was narrow enough that superior numbers would mean nothing, with steep walls that would turn any assault into a killing ground for defenders positioned on the high ground. More importantly, it was Cherokee sacred ground. If they were going to die, there was no better place to make their final stand. They reached Thunder Falls just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky the color of spilled blood. The pass was exactly as Ayanna had described, a narrow defile between towering limestone cliffs, with a thunderous cascade that gave the place its name, providing both concealment and a source of fresh water. But it was the ancient battlefield itself that took Cale's breath away. Stone cairns marked the spots where Cherokee warriors had fallen, and the cliff faces bore pictographs that told the story of their sacrifice in symbols older than any written language. This was hallowed ground, soaked with the blood of heroes who had chosen death over dishonor. We're not the first, Ayan said quietly, his young voice filled with awe as he read the ancient symbols. Others have stood here before us. And others will stand here after us, Ayanna replied, beginning to unpack the supplies she'd been carrying since their escape from Fort Campbell. That's how it works. Each generation defends the sacred places for the next. The supplies turned out to be far more than simple camping gear. Somehow, during their flight through the mountains, Ayanna had acquired enough weapons and ammunition to equip a small army. Cherokee made arrows with obsidian points that could punch through military uniforms. Black powder charges that could turn loose rocks into deadly projectiles. And most impressively, a dozen rifles that she'd somehow liberated from various military outposts during their journey. How? Cale asked, staring at the arsenal she'd spread across the ancient battlefield. I told you, I've been preparing for this war for 3 years. Ayanna began checking each weapon with the thoroughness of a professional soldier. Every time I struck at the men who killed my family, I took their weapons. Every cache I raided. Every outpost I burned. I saved something for the day when the Cherokee would need to fight again. You knew this day would come. I made sure this day would come. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the full scope of what she'd been planning. Fort Campbell wasn't just a rescue mission, Cale. It was a declaration of war. I made sure Harrison would have to respond, Made sure he'd bring enough force to make this fight meaningful. You used us as bait. I used myself as bait. You and Ian were just caught up in something that was always going to happen. She stood and moved to the pass entrance, studying the approach routes with the eye of someone who had been trained for exactly this type of defensive engagement. The Cherokee have been retreating for 50 years, giving ground, accepting smaller reservations, letting them steal our children and destroy our culture piece by piece. Someone had to draw a line in the earth and say no further, even if it means dying here, especially if it means dying here. Ayanna turned back to him, and her expression was serene as a mountain lake. My grandmother used to say that some things are worth more than life: honor, heritage, the right to raise your children as Cherokee rather than as pale imitations of white people. And if we lose, then we lose as Cherokee warriors defending sacred ground. But if we win— She smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was an expression of pure joy rather than predatory satisfaction. If we win, then every Cherokee child for the next 100 years will know that their people never stopped fighting. They spent the night preparing Thunder Falls for siege warfare, using techniques that Ayanna had learned from her father and grandfather and great-grandfather, stretching back to the beginning of Cherokee military history. Stone barriers that would channel attackers into killing zones, hidden weapon caches that could be reached even under heavy fire, escape routes that only someone raised in these mountains would know how to find. But more than the physical preparations, they performed the spiritual rituals that Cherokee warriors had observed before battle since time immemorial. Ayanna sang the ancient war songs in a voice that seemed to echo off the canyon walls long after the notes had faded. Ayan helped gather sacred plants that would be burned to carry their prayers to the spirits of their ancestors. And Cale painted the traditional war markings on his face with clay mixed with water from the sacred falls. Tomorrow they'll come, Ayanna said as they settled in for what might be their last night alive. Harrison's not the type to wait. He'll attack at dawn with everything he's got. Are you afraid? Cale asked. No, she replied, and he believed her. Fear is for people who have something left to lose. I lost everything 3 years ago. Tomorrow, I either get my revenge or I join my family in the spirit world. Either way, the running stops. And if by some miracle we survive? Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire they'd built in the shelter of the ancient stone cairns. When she spoke, her voice carried a note he'd never heard before, something that might have been hope. If we survive, then maybe it's time to stop being Cherokee refugees and start being Cherokee warriors again. Maybe it's time to reclaim what was taken from us instead of just mourning what we've lost. You're talking about war. I'm talking about justice. She looked at him across the dancing flames, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of something that made his heart race. The Cherokee were never meant to be a broken people living on scraps of land that nobody else wanted. We were meant to be free, to raise our children in the ways of our ancestors, to walk these mountains as equals rather than as fugitives. That world is gone, Ayanna. Is it? She gestured toward the pictographs that covered the canyon walls, toward the stone markers that commemorated ancient victories. Our ancestors faced impossible odds before and found ways to win. Maybe it's time we remembered how. As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the mountain passes, growing steadily louder as Harrison's cavalry approached their final destination. The hunt was over, the trap was closing, and by tomorrow's sunset, Thunder Falls would either be hallowed ground once again or the site of one more Cherokee defeat. But as Cale looked at Ayanna's face in the firelight, at the fierce determination burning in her dark eyes, he realized something that took his breath away. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly happy. Not satisfied, not grimly determined, but genuinely, radiantly happy. She was finally going home to the ancient battlefield where Cherokee warriors had always belonged, where she could stop running and start fighting, where she could honor her ancestors by joining them in the kind of battle that songs were written about. Tomorrow would bring either victory or a glorious death. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Ayanna Stormcrow was exactly where she was meant to be. Dawn broke over Thunder Falls like blood spilling across broken glass, painting the limestone cliffs crimson and gold as the mist rose from the ancient battleground. Colonel Harrison's 300 soldiers had arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, taking positions along the ridgelines that overlooked the sacred pass with the precision of men who had done this dance of death many times before. Cale lay flat against the cold stone behind a Cherokee war cairn that had stood for 2 centuries, his rifle trained on the narrow defile where the first assault would come. Beside him, Ayanna moved like a ghost between the defensive positions they'd prepared, checking weapons and ammunition with the calm efficiency of someone who had been born for this moment. "First wave will be cavalry," she said quietly, settling into position behind a natural stone breastwork. "Harrison's too impatient for a proper siege, and he's got political pressure from Washington to end this quickly. He'll try to overwhelm us with shock and speed." "How many?" Cale asked, though he could already see the answer forming up in the valley below. Perhaps 50 mounted soldiers, sabers gleaming in the morning light, horses pawing at the ground with barely contained energy. "Enough to make this interesting." Ayanna checked the percussion caps on her rifle, then looked over at young Ian, who crouched behind a boulder with a bow that seemed almost too large for his thin frame. "Remember what I taught you, little brother. Aim for the horses, not the riders. A cavalry charge without horses is just angry men on foot." The boy nodded, his face painted with the traditional war markings that transformed him from a frightened captive into a Cherokee warrior defending his ancestral home. He was still weak from his months in captivity, but his eyes held the same fierce determination that burned in his older brother. "Signal from Harrison," Ayanna observed, watching the valley through her field glasses. "Here they come." The cavalry charge that erupted from the mouth of Thunder Falls was magnificent and terrible, a wave of blue uniforms and flashing steel that thundered up the narrow pass with the force of an avalanche. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like war drums, mixing with the battle cries of soldiers who had fought Seminoles in Florida swamps and Comanche on Texas plains. But Thunder Falls had been chosen by Cherokee war chiefs for reasons that became immediately apparent as the charge reached the killing ground. The pass narrowed to barely 20 feet across, forcing the cavalry into a column that could only attack 3 abreast. The steep walls channeled them like water flowing through a funnel, eliminating their numerical advantage and turning their speed into a liability. Ayanna's first shot dropped, the lead horse in a tangle of thrashing limbs and screaming animal terror that blocked the pass like a fallen tree. Her second shot took down the cavalry captain, who was trying to rally his men for another charge. By the time she was reaching for her third cartridge, the charge had dissolved into chaos. Rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed to create maximum disruption rather than simple killing. A horse here, a horse there, turning the narrow pass into an obstacle course of wounded animals and dismounted riders who found themselves fighting on foot in terrain that favored defenders with nothing left to lose. Young Ian's arrows whispered through the morning air like angry spirits, their obsidian points finding gaps in military gear with accuracy that would have impressed his ancestors. The boy might be weak in body, but his spirit burned with the accumulated fury of every Cherokee child who had been stolen from their families. The first assault lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the surviving cavalry retreated in disorder, leaving behind a dozen horses and riders in the killing ground below. Colonel Harrison's voice could be heard echoing across the valley, shouting orders that sounded increasingly desperate as he began to understand the magnitude of the tactical problem he faced. "He's learning," Ayanna said with grim satisfaction. reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. Next wave will be infantry, probably with covering fire from the ridgelines. Can we hold? We can hold until we run out of ammunition or they find a way around the pass. She gestured toward the ancient pictographs that covered the canyon walls, telling the story of Cherokee warriors who had faced similar odds. Our ancestors held this place for 3 days against 1,000 Spanish soldiers. We can do better. The second assault came an hour later, preceded by a barrage of rifle fire from soldiers positioned on the surrounding heights. Lead balls whined off the limestone walls like angry hornets, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down while a column of infantry advanced up the pass in good order. This attack was everything the cavalry charge had not been: methodical, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. The soldiers moved like clockwork, one rank firing while another reloaded, advancing by bounds with the kind of tactical precision that had made the United States Army a force to be reckoned with across 2 continents. But they were fighting on ground that had been consecrated by Cherokee blood, defended by people who understood that defeat meant not just death, but the extinction of everything they held sacred. Ayanna had turned Thunder Falls into a fortress, using the natural features of the terrain to create interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a costly proposition. Her hidden weapon caches came into play now, allowing her to move between positions like a deadly phantom, appearing long enough to deliver devastating fire before vanishing into passages that only she knew existed. She fought with the supernatural awareness of someone who had studied these cliffs since childhood, who knew every crack and crevice that could provide concealment. Cale found himself falling into the rhythm of combat with an ease that surprised him. Load, aim, fire, reload, the mechanical sequence that kept him alive while chaos raged around him. His rifle spoke again and again, each shot carefully placed to break up the advancing formations and force the soldiers to take cover among the rocks where Cherokee tactics gave the defenders every advantage. The turning point came when a company of infantry reached the halfway point in the pass, close enough that their officers were shouting orders for a final charge that would carry them to the Cherokee positions. It was then that Ayanna triggered the surprise she had been saving for exactly this moment. The explosion that followed shook the canyon walls like an earthquake, bringing down tons of carefully prepared stone in an avalanche that buried the advancing soldiers under Cherokee justice measured in granite and limestone. The blast had been shaped by someone who understood both engineering and warfare, channeling the force to create maximum destruction while leaving the defender positions intact. When the dust settled, the pass was completely blocked by fallen rock and broken men. The few soldiers who had survived the avalanche were retreating in disorder, carrying their wounded and screaming warnings about Cherokee sorcery and ancient curses. Black powder charges, Ayanna explained to Cale's questioning look. My father taught me that sometimes the best weapon is the mountain itself. The third assault never came. Instead, Colonel Harrison tried a different approach: negotiation. His voice echoed across the valley through a speaking trumpet, carrying terms that might have seemed generous under different circumstances. Cherokee warriors, you have fought with honor, but you cannot win. Surrender now, and I guarantee safe passage to the Western Territories. Continue this fight, and you will all die in that canyon. Ayanna's response came in the form of a rifle shot that knocked the speaking trumpet from Harrison's hands, followed by a war cry that seemed to make the canyon walls themselves tremble with ancient power. Her message was clear enough that even a career military officer could understand it. The standoff that followed lasted through the remainder of the day and into the night. Harrison's forces maintained their positions on the ridgelines, but made no further attempts to storm the pass. The Cherokee defenders took turns sleeping and keeping watch, conserving their strength for whatever dawn might bring. It was during the dark hours before morning that everything changed. Ayan was on watch when he spotted them shadows moving through the forest, with the fluid grace of people who had been born to these mountains. At first, he thought they might be Harrison's soldiers attempting a flanking maneuver. Then he saw the war paint and recognized the weapons, and his heart leaped with hope he had thought was dead forever. "Cherokee warriors," he whispered, shaking. His brother awake, coming up from the South Valley. Cale rose and peered into the pre-dawn gloom, counting silhouettes that moved with the supernatural stealth of people who could make the forest itself their ally. 20 warriors, then 30, then more appearing from concealment like spirits materializing from the morning mist. "It's impossible," he said. "There are no Cherokee war parties left in these mountains." "No," Ayanna said softly, her voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "But there are Cherokee fathers whose children were taken to Fort Campbell. Cherokee mothers whose sons and daughters disappeared into government schools. Cherokee families who have been waiting for someone to show them it was possible to fight back." The arriving warriors were led by a man Cale recognized: Joseph Ridge, grandson of the famous Cherokee leader who had once walked in the halls of Washington as an equal to presidents and senators. Ridge had been thought dead for years, killed during the removal wars that followed the Trail of Tears. "Ayanna Stormcrow," Ridge said as he approached their position, his voice carrying the kind of respect usually reserved for war chiefs and legendary heroes. "Word of Thunder Falls has spread through Cherokee country like wildfire. They're calling you the one who made the mountains remember how to fight." "I'm calling myself someone who got tired of running," she replied. But Cale could see how Ridge's words affected her. For 3 years, she had been a lone wolf, striking at enemies who seemed too powerful to defeat. Now, for the first time, she was no longer alone. "How many?" Cale asked. 80 warriors from 5 different bands, with more coming every hour," Ridge replied. "Families who thought their children were gone forever, men who believed the Cherokee spirit had been broken, women who were told they had to accept whatever scraps the government chose to give them. And now?" Ridge's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "Now they've seen that 3 Cherokee warriors held Thunder Falls against 300 soldiers. Now they believe it's possible to win." The dawn attack that followed was unlike anything in Cherokee military history. Instead of defending a fixed position, they flowed down from the cliffs like an avalanche of vengeance, striking at Harrison's forces from every direction at once. The colonel's well-ordered formations dissolved into chaos as warriors who had learned their trade fighting alongside Andrew Jackson turned those same skills against the army that had betrayed them. Ayanna fought like a force of nature unleashed, moving through the battle with deadly grace as she settled accounts that had been 3 years in the making. Every shot, every knife thrust, every war cry was payment against a debt written in Cherokee blood and tears. The battle raged for 2 hours before Harrison's forces broke and ran, leaving behind their dead and wounded in a panicked retreat that would carry them all the way back to Kentucky. The Cherokee had not just won a skirmish, they had won a victory that would be remembered for generations. As the sounds of battle faded and the morning mist rose from Thunder Falls, Cale found himself standing beside Ayanna on the ancient battlefield where their people had once made their stand against impossible odds. Around them, Cherokee warriors were tending their wounded and collecting weapons from the fallen, but their eyes kept returning to the woman who had shown them that resistance was possible. "What happens now?" Cale asked. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley where Cherokee warriors moved with the confidence of people who had reclaimed their birthright. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to lead through blood and sacrifice. "Now we stop being refugees in our own land," she said. "Now we teach them that some things can't be taken, some people can't be broken, and some mountains will always belong to the Cherokee." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of something that took his breath away. Not just victory, but hope. The kind of hope that could rebuild nations and restore broken people to their former greatness. "Now we go home," she said simply, "all of us." 3 months after the Battle of Thunder Falls, the Cherokee Nation had been reborn in fire and blood. What had begun as one woman's quest for vengeance had transformed into something that Washington's politicians were calling the Cherokee Renaissance. Though they spoke the words with the kind of nervous respect usually reserved for approaching tornadoes. Cale stood on the newly constructed watchtower overlooking the settlement that had grown around Thunder Falls like a forest recovering from wildfire. Below him, Cherokee families were building homes with their own hands, planting crops in soil that had been consecrated by their ancestors' sacrifice, and raising children who would never know the shame of being told they weren't Cherokee enough. For their own land, the transformation had been miraculous and terrifying in equal measure. Word of Ayana's victory had spread through Indian Territory like lightning, bringing Cherokee families streaming back from the western reservations where they'd been dumped like unwanted cargo. Creek and Seminole delegations had arrived to discuss mutual defense pacts. Even some of the scattered bands from the far north had sent representatives to see if the stories were true. They were true. More than true, they were the beginning of something that had seemed impossible just months before. "The council's ready for you," said Joseph Ridge, climbing the watchtower stairs with the easy grace of a man who had rediscovered his purpose. In the months since Thunder Falls, he had become Ayana's closest advisor and the unofficial diplomat for what outsiders were calling the Free Cherokee Territory. "What's the word from Washington?" Cale asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Mixed. Some of the Warhawks are calling for a full military expedition to crush the Cherokee Rebellion before it spreads to other tribes. But the moderates are pointing out that we've done nothing illegal, just defended ourselves against an unprovoked attack and reclaimed land that was never officially ceded." "And President Polk?" Ridge's smile was grim. "President Polk has bigger problems than us right now. The war with Mexico is eating up resources faster than Congress can appropriate them, and he can't afford to open a second front against Indians who aren't actually breaking any treaties." They walked together toward the council house that had been built in the traditional Cherokee style, a circular structure with 7 sides representing the 7 clans, constructed from local timber and stone with the kind of craftsmanship that had once made Cherokee architecture famous throughout the southeastern woodlands. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with possibility and tension. Chiefs and war leaders from a dozen different Cherokee communities sat in a circle, their faces painted with traditional designs that hadn't been seen in public for decades. At the center of the circle, Ayana Stormcrow sat with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place through actions rather than heredity. She had changed in the months since Thunder Falls, though the transformation was subtle enough that someone who hadn't known her before might miss it entirely. The desperate wildness that had once driven her was still there, but it had been tempered by responsibility and shaped by the weight of leadership that had settled on her shoulders like a mantle. "The question before us," she was saying as Cale and Ridge took their places in the circle, "is not whether we can continue to defend our territory. Thunder Falls proved that Cherokee warriors fighting on Cherokee ground are more than a match for any force the United States can send against U.S. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the circle. The victory at Thunder Falls had become legendary among the Cherokee, growing with each telling until it seemed more like divine intervention than military tactics. "The question," Ayana continued, "is what we do with the victory we've won. Do we simply defend what we've reclaimed, or do we use it as the foundation for something larger?" "What did you have in mind?" asked Mary Ridge, Joseph's sister and one of the few women who held the rank of war chief among the Cherokee. She was a formidable figure in her own right, having led the resistance movement in the Western Territories, while Ayana was fighting her private war in the East. "I've been in correspondence with leaders of the Creek Nation, the Seminole, and even some of the northern Iroquois bands," Ayana replied. They're all facing the same pressures we've been dealing with: forced relocation, cultural destruction, the theft of their children. What if we offered them something different, such as an alliance, a confederation of sovereign Indian nations that could negotiate with Washington as equals rather than as conquered peoples begging for scraps? The silence that followed was profound. What Ayanna was suggesting bordered on revolution, not just resistance to specific policies, but a complete restructuring of the relationship between Indian peoples and the United States government. "It's been tried before," said Chief John Ross, the elderly statesman who had led the Cherokee through the darkest years of the removal period. "The confederations always collapse because tribes can't agree on anything long enough to make them work, because they've never had a common cause powerful enough to overcome their differences," Ayanna replied. "Now they do. The government's Indian schools are stealing children from every tribe. The reservation system is starving all of our peoples. The encroachment of white settlers is driving everyone from their ancestral lands. And you think your victory at Thunder Falls changes that? I think my victory at Thunder Falls proves that resistance is possible. More than that, it proves that resistance can succeed." Ayanna stood and moved to the center of the circle, her presence commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with formal authority. "For 50 years, our people have been told that accommodation was the only path to survival. That if we adopted white ways, spoke English, converted to Christianity, and gave up our savage customs, we would be allowed to live in peace. And instead, they stole our children and drove us from our homes anyway," Mary Ridge said bitterly. "Exactly. Which means the choice was never between resistance and accommodation. It was between resistance and extinction." Ayanna's eyes swept the circle, meeting each leader's gaze in turn. Thunder Falls was just the beginning. If we stand together, if we present a united front, we can force Washington to treat us as the sovereign nations we've always been. "You're talking about war," Chief Ross said quietly. "I'm talking about diplomacy backed by the credible threat of force. The United States respects strength. It's the only language they understand. As long as they think they can divide us, defeat us piecemeal, pick us off one tribe at a time, they'll continue doing exactly that." Cale found himself studying the faces around the circle, reading the mixture of hope and fear that Ayanna's words had sparked. These were people who had lived through the Trail of Tears, who had seen their civilization systematically dismantled by a government that viewed Indian culture as an obstacle to be removed. The idea that they could not just survive, but thrive, not just resist but prevail, was almost too much to contemplate. "What would you need?" asked Joseph Ridge. "Time, first of all. The Mexican War won't last forever, and when it ends, Washington will have soldiers to spare for Indian campaigns." Ayanna returned to her seat, her mind clearly working through the logistical challenges of what she was proposing. "We need to build our alliances now, while they're distracted. Establish trade relationships, coordinate our defense plans, create a political structure that can speak for all the allied tribes. And if they refuse to negotiate?" Ayanna's smile was sharp as obsidian. "Then we remind them that Cherokee warriors have been fighting in these mountains for 1,000 years, and we're not planning to stop now." The debate that followed lasted well into the night, with arguments ranging from practical concerns about logistics and supplies to philosophical questions about the nature of sovereignty and self-determination. But as the hours passed, something remarkable began to emerge from the chaos of competing voices. Consensus, not universal agreement, which would have been impossible among Cherokee leaders who prized independence of thought as much as they valued clan loyalty, but a growing recognition that Ayanna's vision represented their best hope for something more than mere survival. When the formal vote was taken just before dawn, the result was overwhelming. The Cherokee Nation would reach out to their neighbors, would offer alliance and mutual support, would work toward the confederation that could restore Indian peoples, to their rightful place as equals among the nations of North America. As the council dispersed, and the leaders returned to their communities to begin the work of building something unprecedented, Cale found himself walking with Ayanna along the trail that led to the sacred falls where their journey together had begun. "Do you really think it can work?" he asked as they paused beside the thundering cascade that had given the place its name. "I think it has to work," she replied, her voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "Because the alternative is watching our children grow up as strangers in their own land, speaking a language that isn't theirs, worshiping gods that aren't ours, living lives that have no connection to the people who came before them. And if it fails, if Washington decides that a confederation of Indian nations is too dangerous to tolerate." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the ancient pictographs that covered the cliff face above the falls. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "Then our children will know that we tried. That when the moment came to choose between comfortable slavery and dangerous freedom, we chose freedom. That their ancestors died as Cherokee, warriors rather than as broken people who had forgotten what it meant to be Cherokee." "You make it sound like we're all going to die." "We're all going to die anyway," she said with a laugh that held no trace of bitterness. "The question is what we accomplish before that happens. Whether we leave behind something worth having died for." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun paint the waterfall gold and silver as it cascaded down stone worn smooth by countless centuries of Cherokee prayers and Cherokee dreams. Around them, the forest was waking up with the sound of birds and small animals going about the business of survival that had continued unchanged since the world was young. "There's something else," Ayanna said eventually, her voice taking on a note that Cale had never heard before, something that might have been vulnerability. "What?" "I've been thinking about what happens after. When the Confederation is established. When the treaties are signed, when the immediate crisis is over." She turned to look at him, and in her dark eyes he saw something that made his breath catch. "I've been thinking about what it would be like to stop fighting long enough to actually live." "What did you have in mind?" "A home, a real home, not just a place to hide between battles." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she was afraid the words might shatter something fragile. "Children who grow up knowing they're Cherokee, who learn the old stories and the old ways, who never have to be ashamed of who they are." "Ayanna, I know it's presumptuous," she said quickly. "I know you didn't ask for any of this, didn't sign up to spend your life with a woman who's made herself the enemy of the United States government. But I thought, I hoped... You hoped what?" "That maybe you'd want to help me build something instead of just tearing things down. That maybe we could be partners in peace the way we've been partners in war." Cale really looked at her, seeing past the war paint and the weapons to the woman underneath. The woman who had risked everything to save his brother. Who had turned her pain into purpose and her grief into the foundation for an entire people's renaissance. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do," he said simply. Her smile was radiant as sunrise, transforming her entire face and making her look younger and more hopeful than he'd ever seen her. "Even if it means spending the rest of your life with someone who's too savage for polite society." "Especially because of that," he replied, reaching out to take her hand. "I never was much for polite society anyway." As they walked back toward the settlement hand in hand, the morning sun climbing higher above the ancient mountains that had sheltered their people for countless generations, Cale felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope, though there was plenty of that. Not just love, though he was beginning to understand that what he felt for Ayanna went deeper than anything he'd thought possible. What he felt was completion. The sense that after years of fighting just to survive, he was finally part of something larger than himself. Something worth building, worth defending, worth passing on to the children who would inherit the world they were creating behind them. Thunder Falls roared its ancient song of power and permanence, while ahead of them lay the future they would build together, Cherokee and free, savage and proud, partners in the grand work of proving that some things could never be conquered. As long as there were people willing to fight for them, the Cherokee nation would rise again. And this time, it would never fall. The Great Council fire burned bright against the autumn sky of 1867, its flames reaching toward stars that had watched over Cherokee ceremony since the world was young. Around the fire, representatives from 17 different Indian nations sat in the ancient circle of equals, their faces painted with the traditional designs of peoples who had refused to disappear into the pages of history books written by their conquerors. Ayanna Nighthawk, she had taken Cale's name in marriage 20 years ago, though she kept her reputation, stood before the assembled delegates with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through actions rather than titles. At 46, her hair showed threads of silver that caught the firelight like precious metal, and her face bore the lines that came from 2 decades of leadership during the most tumultuous period in Indian history since Columbus. But her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had once gotten her labeled too savage by men who couldn't imagine a woman wielding power as naturally as she wielded a knife. Those men were mostly dead now, victims of time and the changing world that the Cherokee Confederation had helped create. 20 years ago, she began, her voice carrying easily across the sacred ground where Thunder Falls had once echoed with the sound of battle. We gathered in this same place to fight for our survival. Tonight, we gather as the sovereign Cherokee Creek Seminole Confederation, allied with the Iroquois Federation of the North and the Lakota Alliance of the Great Plains, to celebrate something our grandparents thought impossible: peace with honor. The murmur of approval that ran through the circle spoke to achievements that would have seemed like fantasy in 1847. Confederation that had begun with Ayanna's desperate gamble at Thunder Falls now controlled territory stretching from the Tennessee mountains to the Oklahoma plains, governed by a constitution that blended Cherokee law with the best elements of Creek and Seminole tradition. More importantly, they controlled it as equals. The Treaty of Cherokee Falls, signed just 3 months ago after 2 years of negotiations, had finally recognized the Confederation as a sovereign nation with the same legal standing as any European power. President Johnson had called it a necessary accommodation to changing realities, but everyone knew it was really a recognition that some people simply could not be conquered. The children of our children will never know the shame of being told they are not Cherokee enough for their own land, Ayanna continued, her words carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. They will learn their letters in Cherokee syllabary alongside English alphabet. They will speak to their grandmothers in the language of their ancestors. They will grow up free. In the audience, she could see faces that told the story of those 20 years. Joseph Ridge, now gray-haired and distinguished, serving as the Confederation's ambassador to Washington. Mary Ridge, who had built the most successful trading company in the Indian Territory and proved that Cherokee women could master commerce as easily as warfare. Chief John Ross, ancient now but still sharp, nodding approval at words that vindicated a lifetime of struggle. And there, sitting in the place of honor reserved for war chiefs, was Ayanna Nighthawk, no longer the frightened boy they had rescued from Fort Campbell, but a man of 32 who had earned his own reputation leading Cherokee warriors in the Confederation's border wars. The white streak in his hair had grown more pronounced with age, making him instantly recognizable throughout Indian Territory as the brother whose rescue had sparked a revolution. But it was the figure beside him that made Ayanna's heart swell, with pride so fierce it threatened to overwhelm her composure. Cale Nighthawk had aged like fine whiskey, his face weathered by 2 decades of responsibility, but his eyes still holding the steady strength that had made her trust him at first sight. As war chief of the Confederation, he had proven that the quiet courage that saved one boy could be scaled up to protect an entire people. Their own children sat nearby, 3 daughters and 2 sons who had grown up in a world where being Cherokee was a source of pride rather than shame, where their mother's reputation as the Stormcrow was matter for celebration rather than whispered fear. They would inherit a homeland that their parents had literally fought to create, along with the responsibility to defend it for the generations yet to come. But tonight is not just about celebration, Ayanna said, her tone shifting to address the challenges that still lay ahead. The Transcontinental Railroad will be completed within 2 years, bringing settlers and soldiers to our borders in numbers we've never faced before. Gold has been discovered in the Black Hills, which means the Lakota will soon face the same pressures we overcame 20 years ago. The world is changing faster than ever, and we must change with it or be swept aside. The assembled delegates leaned forward, recognizing the transition from ceremonial commemoration to strategic planning. This was how the Confederation had survived and thrived, by never allowing celebration to blind them to emerging threats, by always preparing for the next challenge even while savoring hard-won victories. Our children will face tests we cannot imagine, Ayanna continued. They will need to master technologies we are only beginning to understand, navigate political complexities that make our struggles seem simple by comparison, defend our sovereignty against pressures that will make the Indian Wars look like border skirmishes. And they will be ready, said a voice from the circle. It was Running Bear, war chief of the Lakota delegation and a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance rivaled Ayanna's own. Because they will have learned from our example that some things are worth any sacrifice. Because they will know, added Sequoia Ridge, Joseph's son and the Confederation's current president, that their ancestors faced impossible odds and found ways to win anyway. Because they will understand, concluded Chief Standing Wolf of the Creek Nation, that being civilized doesn't mean abandoning who you are, it means being strong enough to remain yourself in a world that wants to make you into something else. Ayanna nodded, feeling the truth of their words settle into her bones like warmth from the sacred fire. This was what they had built, what they had fought for, what they had almost died to achieve, not just territory or political recognition, but the knowledge that cultural survival was possible even in a world determined to destroy difference. As the formal ceremony concluded and the delegates began to drift toward the feast that would follow, Ayanna found herself walking alone toward the place where Thunder Falls roared its eternal song of power and permanence. The battlefield where her legend had been born was now a memorial park, its ancient pictographs supplemented by newer carvings that told the story of the battle that changed everything. She wasn't alone for long. Cale appeared beside her as naturally as sunrise, his presence as comforting after 20 years of marriage as it had been during those desperate days, when they were just 2 Cherokee fighters against the world. Second thoughts? He asked, reading her mood with the supernatural accuracy that came from 2 decades of partnership. Third and fourth thoughts, she admitted. Wondering if we've prepared them for what's coming, if they'll be strong enough to face challenges we can't even imagine. They'll be Cherokee, Cale said simply. That's enough, is it? The world our children will inherit will be more dangerous than anything we faced. More complex, more demanding, more ready to destroy everything we've built if they show the slightest weakness. Cale was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the waterfall that had witnessed so much history, so much transformation, so much hope fulfilled against impossible odds. You know what I think? He said finally. I think our children will do exactly what we did, whatever it takes to protect what matters most. They'll adapt, they'll innovate, they'll find ways to be Cherokee in a world that's completely different from ours. How can you be so certain? Because they're your children. And if there's one thing I've learned in 20 years of watching, you turn impossible dreams into Cherokee reality. It's that Stormcrow women don't know how to quit. Ayanna felt herself smiling for the first time that evening, Not the diplomatic smile she wore at public ceremonies, but the real expression of joy that Cale had been drawing from her since their first night in the mountains. Besides, he added with the dry humor that had made her fall in love with him, if they inherited even half of your capacity for righteous fury and brilliant tactical planning, the United States government should be more worried about them than they are about us. They stood together in the growing darkness, two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and built something lasting from the ashes of destruction. Around them, the Cherokee Nation celebrated achievements that would have seemed impossible when they first met at Bitter Creek Trading Post, while above them the stars looked down on a people who had refused to disappear into the convenient categories that their enemies had prepared for them. "I love you," Ayanna said quietly, the words carrying the weight of 20 years' worth of shared struggles and victories. "I know," Cale replied, pulling her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat steady against her chest. "I've loved you since the moment you stood up to that room full of criminals and showed them what Cherokee courage looked like, even though I was too savage for any man. Especially because you were too savage for any man. Fortunately," he added with a grin that made him look exactly like the warrior who had rescued his brother and found his destiny, "I was never interested in being any man. I wanted to be your man." As they walked back toward the celebration, hand in hand like teenagers despite their gray hair and accumulated scars, Ayanna felt the last of her evening's melancholy dissolve into something much more powerful: gratitude for the life they had built together, pride in the people they had helped create, and absolute confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, the Cherokee Nation would meet them as they had met every test for the past 20 years. Together, as equals, as Cherokee, the Stormcrow had taught her people to fight for their freedom. Now her children would learn to use that freedom to build something even better, a future where being Cherokee was not just about survival, but about showing the world what indigenous people could accomplish when they refused to be anything less than themselves. Some things, she reflected as the laughter and music of the celebration reached them on the night wind, were indeed worth any sacrifice. And some victories were worth 20 years of war, but the sweetest victory of all was the one that let you stop fighting long enough to enjoy the peace you had won.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.